Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which will assess the French EU Council presidency. We will be talking about and trying to answer the question of whether we have been able to build on a more sovereign Europe in a new global age. And to do that and to kick off this discussion, this round of discussion, I would like to welcome in particular the French ambassador to Austria. And I would like to ask Gilles Pécout for his introduction before we start with the interaction of the panel. Please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général of Österreichische Gesellschaft für Europapolitik. Thank you, Paul. Even if the French presidency of the European Council is not yet completed, and we observe that how these two last weeks have been, and in the last days have been and are active, I really thank the CFA and the Institut Montaigne to give this opportunity to make a point, a show about the presidency with the bright set of experts Paul will introduce. Your topic is the question of a more sovereign European Union in the new geopolitical age. So I will just deliver some very brief, very busy remarks about the end of the process, and above all, upon the meaning of European Union sovereignty in our troubled chronology of the French presidency in the timeline of the last semester, with the question of whether or not we entered a new regime of historicity for the European geopolitics. Just some preliminary observation about the context of and the itinerary of this European Union sovereignty during the presidency, really briefly. First of all, let me remind that the starting point was really the proposal of a new geopolitics, a real proposal of a new geopolitics at the beginning of our presidency. There is a new ambition. There is really a new ambition. There were a new ambition of sovereignty at the origin of the French European Union Council presidency. And let me say a global one. From the beginning, defining a turning point for Europe, to use the initial quote from the President de la République, Macron, was mentioning precisely a geopolitical turning point. I may recall, for instance, some public declarations before and at the beginning of our presidency, and namely, if you remember, an interview for the journal Le Grand Continent of the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Just to sum up, the key notion is a geopolitical future of Europe. And I quote, nous sommes d'accord que le futur de l'Europe est un futur géopolitique. We agree that the future of Europe has to be a geopolitical future, meaning clearly that citizens are looking for a new kind of geopolitics. What does it mean precisely? I think four imperative conditions. Granted, protection of European borders with stability of our neighbors as Western Balkans or Central Europe. Secondly, a new definition of concrete sovereignty and autonomy based on restoration of manufacturing and technology and health and pharmaceutical industries. Third, not only autonomy, but new mechanisms of global solidarity, economic, geopolitical, with the other continents. And finally, the new geopolitics should be the opportunity of claiming and spreading a new form of universalism and humanism based on safety, rule of law, education, and training. So now, after reminding this point, this starting point, the normal question at end of June should be, what are the results of such an ambitious program? Actually, I think I don't need to go through all the decisions and measures taken during the semester. But let me recall the strategic compass, the gradual steps for rebuilding Schengen, the increasing of defense spending, the protection of the European production and strong consumer market in a responsible approach of green and digital transition. And by the way, just a statement, if I may, just to say that the internal French political agenda with the electoral, presidential and parliament round didn't avoid the government to carry out and to finalize the European task as in the task of the presidency of the European Union Council. But your question, our question at the heart of our common reflection is not upon internal political conditions, but about the impact of the dramatic predicament. Much has been said about the impact of the war, and much has been written about the cohesion and the unpredictable consistency as the first consequences of the war in Ukraine for European Union. Sovereignty has been reinforced, not redefined, but reinforced in the wake of the great principles I have just mentioned. Let me perhaps just add 3 things about the meaning of sovereignties in terms of new priorities in the wake of the global geopolitical approaches. Facing the war, first of all, the European Union, led by the French presidency, reached a new step in the question of energy autonomy. It's really obvious, I have not to remind this, with a clear definition of the goal, the purpose, the ambition, and the means after the meeting of Versailles. We are more and more aware that connectivity and energy securities are 2 cardinal pillars of sovereignty. It's not something new, but we have really given the means. Second, and it's obvious but less evoked. In front of the war, or facing the war, the European Union is now sure that we have to be ready to organize more efficiently a very important narrative counteroffensive in front of the classical war propaganda of Russia. And our concept of European sovereignty means, and really does means, a more reliable and secure flow of information, namely about agrarian and food consequences of the war, and above all, for the other continents and for Africa. Sovereignties includes really, and a new definition, or the definition of sovereignty has to include really this safety, or how to say it, this more reliable flow of information as a counter narrative. Third and last remark, it's about the most obvious fact. It's about the format of a sovereign Europe. At the end of the French presidency, and certainly due to the war, the European Union leaders have clearly expressed their support for a new format of Europe as a territorial configuration, but to go on being a sovereign continent, this format has to be a gradual one and a progressive one, as it has been put by the President de la République, the French President de la République, and the other European leaders. The result is very known. is the proposal of unambiguous new formats of integration, exploring innovative ways to advance the accession talks, to incentivize reforms, and that going from Ukraine to Western Balkans. Now, if I were asked to suggest my own question to your future accompanying discussion today, I might ask the simple one: what should be the role of the format of Slavkov in both reacting to war and preparing a new methodology of gradual enlargement in the wake of the French presidency and in transition to the Czech one? Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce your, I'm sure, very interesting discussion.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for giving so much input for our discussion. I think you're already laying the ground actually for our interaction here. And if you stay with us a little bit, whenever you feel like coming into the discussion, please feel free to do so. I think you can add a lot to this exchange of opinions, and already pointing to the elements that you have described, I think this is actually a great starting point for our discussion. Thank you very much for your introduction in that respect. Now, but now let me move to this perfect and very interesting lineup of people which we have today and introduce them to you. I would like to start with Vladislava Gubalova. Vladislava, welcome. Good to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Vladislava is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Europe, which is part of the Globsec Policy Institute in Bratislava in Slovakia. And her research focus, if I'm not mistaken, is in particular on European foreign policy, European integration, and the future of Europe, as well as the Central and Eastern European region and its place in the European Union. And this comes very handy because the ambassador just pointed, he finished by asking a very interesting question, which actually will lead us to the debate on the future of Europe. Welcome, Vladislava. Let me also welcome Georgina Wright. Hello, Georgina. Georgina.
Oh, Paul, sorry, the mute button. Hello, nice to be with you.
Good to have you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Georgina is British. She lives in Paris. She works as a senior fellow and director of the Institut Montaigne. She's a director of the Europe program there, but she's also a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She is an associate of the Institute for Government in London and a senior fellow at the Center for Britain and Europe at the University of Surrey. Very good to have you. We've met many times before. Before moving to Paris, she worked at the Institute for Government in London, and before that at Chatham House as a research associate. Now, let me also welcome Hans-Dietmar Schweisgut. Hello, Dietmar, good to have you. Dietmar Schweisgut has been the Secretary General of the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe since the beginning of 2019. Before that, he had been for many, many years a very important diplomat for Austria, but also for the European Union. He, just to name a few posts where he actually worked, he was 2 times Austrian ambassador to Asia. He was Austrian ambassador to Japan and to China. He was also there as an EU ambassador, in fact. And he was also Austria's permanent representative to the European Union in Brussels. Very good to have you, Ambassador Schweisgut. And let me also welcome Žiga Faktor. Hello, Žiga.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation.
Žiga is connected to us from Brussels, if I'm not mistaken. He works at the Europeum, a leading Czech think tank in Prague. And he's also a member of the Prague European Summit, where he is part of the organizing team. And previously he worked at the Slovenian embassy in Prague for several years. So he can give us a lot of insight regarding the upcoming Czech Council presidency. But before we talk about the Czech Council presidency, we would like to assess, of course, already today, 28th of June, the last 6 months of the French EU Council presidency. But before we get started, let me also in particular very much welcome all the participants who have joined us and who have registered for our event. And if you look at your Zoom screen, below there's one button which says Q&A. So whenever you have a question or you want to comment on something, please use this Q&A button. And we will make sure your comment or question is put forward to the panel, and you can in that way join our discussion. Now, let me kickstart with the assessment of the French EU Council presidency. Georgina, let me start with you. I mean, this was a very unusual European Council presidency. We always say that about Council presidency, and we always say that how can you actually prepare for something when usually something unexpected happens? But no one, or not many of us, would actually have expected a war to take place on European soil, starting with the Russian aggression against Ukraine on the 24th of February. It was also a European Council presidency who just came out of where Europe just came out of the pandemic, or had at least some moments to take breath, but still trying to tackle the economic consequences of this pandemic. And it was a very special EU Council presidency, not only because it was the French EU Council presidency, but because it was also during an electoral cycle, which was, of course, due to the reshufflement because of the Brexit situation. Now, the ambassador said that the parliamentary election, and of course also the presidential election, didn't avoid to carry out the European tasks. What is your assessment, first assessment of the last 6 months, when you compare ambition with the actual track record?
Well, thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and also for the very interesting question. Of course, it's always difficult to come after the French ambassador, so merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, for those interesting points. I mean, to think back at the start of the French presidency, the last time France had the presidency was in 2008. And if you recall, there was a Russian aggression there too, in Georgia. But of course, France was playing a different role because we didn't have a president of the European Council at that stage, and the High Representative had different competences. So in 2008, France was much more visible in kind of managing and responding to that aggression. Of course, this time around, you had a much more visible, I think, Commission acting in response to the war in Ukraine. But this was nonetheless a very, very important presidency for France, and they won't have it for another 14 years. So it was really important for them that they got it right. And I think overall, obviously it depends who you ask, whether they thought it was a success, but I think overall on balance, it was a good presidency. I think the French government will be pleased with what they've managed to achieve. This was a presidency that very much followed on from President Macron's 2017 speech at the Sorbonne, where he identified sort of 6 key areas for how the EU should evolve, and in true sort of Macron fashion, put forward lots and lots of ideas of how you could achieve that. And this presidency was no less ambitious. So my colleague and I, Cecilia Vido-Tolavesi, we analysed the French programme, which landed, on New Year's Eve, which was not fun for the analysts who had to look at it. And I sort of thank the Czech government for already publishing their programme in advance. But nonetheless, over 60 priorities and a hugely ambitious presidency. And as you said at the start, there was no indication that there would be a war. But it was also a presidency that was happening mid-mandate for the European Commission, for the European Parliament and the European Council. So there was a lot of ongoing EU work. Speaking to someone from the French government this morning who said 350 texts that were being discussed at the time. And that's a huge concentration of texts, but it also means France inherited a lot as well. A lot of work that it kind of wanted, because it had been sort of really pushing for certain dossiers to get to where they did when they got the presidency, but nonetheless a lot of ongoing EU work. But it also managed to launch lots of new dialogues. So I think the French government feels fairly happy with the fact that on Schengen, and the ambassador said this, you know, they managed to kind of at least pour in new life into that Schengen discussion that was completely blocked for 2 years. They organised numerous summits in Brussels and in France. I think of the EU-African Union Summit, for example, and they hosted a number of meetings all across France, so not just in Paris, but in Toulouse, in Brest, and lots of other places, touching on what President Macron wanted, which was to make the EU more visible and closer to French citizens, but also bring France's ambitions closer to the EU as well. And then I think if you think of the preparation, France did huge amounts of diplomatic outreach, of course, by the ambassador and his team and all his colleagues across the EU. But there was a real willingness to make sure that yes, the program would be a French program, but it would also be a European program, and that's why you had proposals like a Western Balkan summit, which, if you think of French priorities over time, not always a key priority for France, but they still wanted to organize it because other member states said this is important to us. But I think talking to experts and officials across the EU, there is a sense sometimes that France rushed discussions, particularly before the sort of période de réserve électorale, which is the PERDA, which means when the government, you enter an electoral period and you can't make big political announcements. So there was a sense that France rushed a lot of discussions which could have warranted more time, and also that I think some people feel some of the tricky decisions they've simply left to the Czechs and the Swedes, and it's like, we've managed to launch the discussion, we didn't get quite as far as we wanted, but here you go, passing the hot potato on. So in a sense, that's perhaps some of the criticism that's been leveled at it. And then, and I can't help but say this, on Ukraine, I think France behind the scene was incredibly instrumental with the sanctions, and it was out in the press that President Macron rang up Viktor Orban, and that might have helped unblock Hungary's resistance to the sixth package, I think, of sanctions. But overall, sanctions is usually something that's negotiated at the council, but you saw the Commission this time around really be very active in that. But it meant that the EU was sort of leading a lot of the EU's response to Ukraine, because that's just the way it's set out in the treaties. But sometimes the President's comments, whether it's, enlargement will take decades, or, we must be careful about not humiliating Russia. Now, that was taken out of context. A lot of people felt that he was saying we should not humiliate Putin, which of course he wasn't saying. What he was saying is, if and when peace returns, we should unconditionally support Ukraine. Ukraine must win this war. But when we come to the end of this war, there should be no humiliation. Some member states felt that that was really counterproductive, and I think that sort of created a lot of tension as well, and may have kind of basically been one of the top lines of the presidency, even though they were fairly separate. So I'll end on this. There were three, I think, major objectives for President Macron and the French government with the presidency. One was to advance the EU agenda, and I think the ambassador was quite clear on that. There are a number of things, a number of files that have been, from digital to climate to social to defence. There are a number of things that the French government has helped to push forward. The second objective for the French was to show that France had influence in the EU. I mean, it's always ironic to me, being in France, the only people who think France doesn't have any influence in the EU is the French themselves, because everyone else says, oh my goodness, France is everywhere, but not in France. And I'm not sure this presidency has really managed to convince a lot of people in France that France does have influence. And the third was to show that EU membership serves France's interests. And I think a lot of that will depend also on, so the COVID response has been positive to that, the vaccine, but a lot will depend on what happens with energy as well. So I think the French presidency is ongoing, it ends in 2 days, but I think there will be a need for the government to continue talking about what are the key achievements of the French presidency, and in a way remind people that that's not France's job done. It will need to continue working with EU institutions and member states, because it's thanks to them that France was able to achieve as much as it did. So there needs to be ongoing conversation, but I'll stop there.
Georgina, a quick follow-up question to you. Let me try it again. What was the impact of elections on EU the EU Council presidency, and what do you think will be? You finished by talking about or referring to the ongoing work and the ongoing need for France to maintain its high level of European engagement. Do you think with the parliamentary elections this will be more difficult to actually do?
Okay, great question. I think France was given the opportunity to change the timing of its presidency, and President Macron and the government chose to maintain it. So they always planned with, knowing that the calendar, there would be a period where they wouldn't be able to make big political statements. So they sort of organized the work a lot before and after that time. And of course, there was ongoing EU work. We do only talk about the sort of flagship initiatives, but there's a lot that continues, and the French continue to chair meetings in Brussels, and there's a lot that happened, but the big political sort of declarations didn't happen during that time. So my first sort of easy response is they planned for it, even if that meant they rushed certain discussions, which annoyed some member states sometimes. But I think you're right in saying that certainly in France, the election overshadowed the presidency. Right, and there was a point where, particularly between the two rounds, there was a point where people thought that Marine Le Pen was standing a chance to be elected. Well, I think that created a certain level of tension, across the EU. And it's not easy for a new minister to arrive at a council and start chairing a meeting when he or she hasn't been looking at the text or following the dossier, let alone if you have a new president. But it was like sort of 1 or 2 days, and then the polls showed that President Macron was probably going to win again, so that kind of dissipated. But I think on the legislative side, look, Macron didn't get the majority that he wanted, so it's going to be harder. He gave an 8-minute sort of statement to the French about a week ago, saying there are 2 options. One, we can try and form a majority, but if we can't, it's sort of an absolute majority, but if we can't do that, we'll have to do au cas par cas, so we'll have to take one dossier and then we'll have to work in parliament, etc. So some people say this is good for democracy, it's going to force a greater debate. On EU stuff, I think it's an issue, but it's less of an issue than it would be, say, on tax and other domestic policy. And that's partly because a lot of discussions happen, in Brussels and the council between different institutions and everything else. But there might be more of accountability to asking for ministers to come and present, but they do that already. And I'll just end on, I think Clément Beaune, as you know, France's EU minister, has a huge network across Europe, and he's very trusted as an interlocutor. People know him, and there was a sense, I think, across Europe when it didn't look like he was going to be elected, that would be a great shame for Europe. And I think there's a sense of relief that he was re-elected. But it's not going to be the same France, because obviously domestically the French are, not everyone, but lots of people are unhappy. And so there's going to be, the president is going to have to spend more time looking at domestic issues and that, but he will continue to remain active on Europe because it's always been a central pillar of his domestic and foreign policy.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And if Clément Beaune is watching, we'd like to congratulate him and hope to welcome him in this round soon. Now, over to you, Dietmar. What is your first assessment of the impact of the 24th of February on the French Council presidency, on crisis management, and on political leadership in Europe?
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And let me say that I'm very happy, of course, on behalf of the Austrian French Center for Rapprochement in Europe, to be able to do this with you and enjoy the support of the French embassy. And I'm particularly grateful to the French ambassador for not only his introductory remarks, but also for having initiated a series of events which I think are important, not only in the framework bilaterally of French-Austrian relations, but we will also come back to the issue he raised at the end of his speech, namely the impact of the Slavko format, and I will comment at the end of my brief remarks. Now, I would follow up when answering your question, Paul, to what Georgina so rightly and I think very eloquently and comprehensively pointed out. And I think it was important that she not only talked about the main event, namely the war in Ukraine, but also pointed out the task of a presidency and what it actually involves. The 350 or whatever it was text, you know, the legislative machinery which works almost behind the scenes when it comes to public awareness of what happened. And I think the important thing is, if you make an assessment that with a few exceptions, I think the French presidency managed to carry through and implement a hugely ambitious program in spite of the challenge posed by the events after the 24th of February, and also in spite, of course, of the domestic challenges. You mentioned the elections. Now, I would say, and I think here I'm pretty much on the same line as Georgina, that yes, some dossiers might have been rushed through, but by and large, I think the elections did not really have a major impact on the way the French carried out their presidency. It might be another question to what extent the new situation in the Assemblée Nationale will impact European policy in the future. But this is, I think, something which certainly did not really affect very much the French presidency. The second thing is that if you look at the three themes which were sort of the leitmotif of the presidency program, recovery, strength or power, and belonging, were, I think, priorities which very much, I think, enabled the European Union to respond more effectively to the crisis in the Ukraine. I think the only victim, in a way, might have been the fact that before the 24th of February and the events which we are witnessing today, the outlook on economic recovery was, of course, a completely different one. And I think the optimism to what extent the European Union might be able sort of to develop a European vision for 2030 in the area of social policies, health management, etc. That, I think, I wouldn't say fell a bit by the wayside, but it became a victim of anxiety to the fact that we are not really entering a phase of recovery, but of course we are experiencing the fallout of the war in Ukraine. That's I think, a statement which has to be made, but that's of course not the fault of the French presidency. That's the outcome, I think, of the fact that the European Union, in response, I think, to sort of a demand President Macron has been formulating for years, starting with his speech at the Sorbonne, is now being put to the test. And this is actually what happened. And therefore, I would very much agree with Ambassador Gilles Pécout when he said that the war in the Ukraine has not really sort of negatively impacted the ideas on how to go about sovereignty or strategic autonomy, but has
actually quite to the contrary. No, it was a sort of a boost.
Reinforced that. And then the question is a bit, how has the European machinery reacted to that? Georgina pointed out that, of course, contrary to the situation in 2008, when at the time President Sarkozy was, of course, the president of the European Council and sort of single-handedly went to Russia at the time to sort of forge a compromise. I wouldn't call it an agreement, but sort of he was seen as the one who really brokered an outcome of his discussions with President Putin at the time. Now, this is different, but still, I would say, yes, we do have, of course, now a president of the European Council. Yes, the Commission played, I think, a much more important role, especially in devising and then formulating and pushing through the sanctions packages. But I would still venture to say that the fact that a major power like France and a very committed president, committed to the European cause and committed to this concept of European sovereignty, was actually representing the presidency, made a major impact. And I think this is simply a fact of life in the European Union. Small presidencies can do extremely well, and we have numerous examples of that. They tend to do less well when you have a major event and a major crisis, where what you do need in a new geopolitical age is also political clout, which of course a larger country brings more easily to the table. That's simply a fact. And I doubt very much that sort of very few other heads of state or government could have sort of talked to President Putin. Now, I know very much this has also been criticized, and Georgina has pointed out some of the remarks which have been taken out of context. But I still think, you know, it's that's actually the duty of a statement, to do everything possible in respect of the overall views and position of the European Union to attempt to get this position through to the other side and see if a discussion can lead to an end which is respectful to the views and wishes of all member states. And I think this is what he did. And I think it's also to be noteworthy that when it comes to support to the Ukraine, it's actually France which has been doing much more, especially in terms of military cooperation, in terms of delivery of hardware, than most other countries. So in that respect, I think one should not downplay sort of the role of the French presidents and say all the decisions were taken at the European Council. And I think it's interesting also to see that this very complicated machinery which we have in the European Union, with the president of the Commission, with the president of the European Council, with the rotating presidency, which in the past has very often been criticized as being ineffective and slow, in this case actually has been able to reinforce each other. So I think if you look at it from outside the European Union, this is one of the cases, I think, where nobody really, neither in the United States nor elsewhere, would have said, well, it was so difficult to negotiate with the European Union, they have been slow. No, I think in this case, the European Union has been able to show that even with relatively complicated procedures, you can make an impact. Now, the one thing which, of course, also fell a bit by the wayside is the conference on the future of Europe. And
that's what I was going to ask you now.
and of course, there were already, I think, questions before the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, whether in a more normal presidency this would have taken sort of a priority seat, and a lot of people sort of doubted that. Now, given the war in Ukraine, it's only natural that this could not really have the kind of visibility it would have otherwise. But it was, I think, presented, was put on the table. There's scope for follow-up, but of course this follow-up was never really intended to be for the French presidency.
Dietmar, let me ask you a question regarding the conference on the future of Europe. When you say that this follow-up was never intended by the French presidency, it reminds me of the impression that actually the conference on the future of Europe was something that was implemented because of the high ambition of the country to accelerate the integration process and to rethink European integration. And many analysts would argue that this is why actually a period of 12 months was defined, which would then culminate on the 9th of May during the French Council presidency. And but it seems to be that has France lost the interest in the Conference on the Future of Europe?
I think there were other pressing issues, and I think first and foremost, the reason why the Conference on the Future of Europe, of course, did not really take off as we wanted it was the onset of the pandemic and everything which followed thereafter. And then the war on the Ukraine, of course, was just a compounding factor. But let me close by making one final point, and that is, of course, one thing we are seeing in the European Union as a result of the Ukrainian war is more, in a way, more diversity in as much as we see a greater weight when it comes to security issues in the eastern part of the European Union. It's very clear that Poland, the Baltic states, and others have been on the front line, and this has also been very much reflected, of course, in the way this was discussed. The important thing is that this did not really undercut unity, and I'm leaving for a moment Hungary aside because that's a different issue. And that, I think, is important, and I think it's also one of the reasons why I believe, Ambassador, to address your question, what would be the role of the Slavko format? I think that this dialogue between France, Austria, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia could, in a way, be sort of an intellectual bridge-building exercise in making sure that we understand different views more easily, which of course are the result of geography and different risk and security assessments. And this is, I think, something also for the future.
Maybe we could also consider a format Slavkov Plus, including Poland, with this new shift of geopolitical centers and narratives within the European Union, without jeopardizing the unity, as you have said, Dietmar. And the second thing that I wanted to emphasize is that, and something that you have stressed, is that only because we have a high degree of institutional complexity within the European Union doesn't mean that crisis management cannot be surprisingly efficient. So if there's a will, there's actually a way. So the more political will we have, and it's not even a question of competences sometimes, because if you look at the joint procurement on vaccines, or also the idea of buying jointly military equipment and investing in producing this equipment, I think there are a lot of this idea of European sovereignty comes in, but this is something that has not always to do with competences, but with political will, I think. With that, I would like to move over to Vladislava. Vladislava, if you look through what we have just been talking about, if you look at what we've just been talking about through through Slovak lenses, what is your impression and what is your perception of these developments during the French EU Council presidency?
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Your Excellency, for providing us with food for thought in your remarks. Yes, I would try to do a non-exhaustive assessment through the perspective of Central European region, and I think Žiga also will chime in very well after me on the region and Slovakia in more particular. And maybe just to backtrack a bit and agree with Georgina, what she mentioned about the preparatory work for the French presidency. It was noted in the region that actually French officials were traveling to us and talking to us and noting that there are differences in priorities, differences in understanding how we should move forward on what the next years we should focus. So this was exemplary work when it comes to preparation for the presidency. Now, Of course, I think that when in Slovakia and in the region we are trying to assess the presidency, undoubtedly those results will be looked through the lenses of the Russian war in Ukraine. Once the Russian invasion started, the region and Slovakia found themselves literally at the doorstep of a war. This meant immediate security danger. This meant flows of refugee immediately, immediate economic consequences, and shortly after starting with the energy hardship and certain consequences. But then, as we already pointed out, is that in this context, actually the French presidency will be remembered to be able to coordinate the most assertive response of a real threat to the Union and the support of Ukraine. So what already we have seen, and I think in the region as well, we see is that the EU was able to act as a credible global player, united and actually fast, right? So these were the novelty in the sense that the unity was kept and speed was the novelty. So what we mentioned that yes, maybe France was not seen as such a leading force. We know that on the background, so much was done for the coordination, including the sanction packages, including, yes, as was the suggestion, that maybe the background work on convincing political leaders to keep the unity. And of course, the last week, what we saw with the granting of the EU candidacy status to Ukraine and to Moldova. And this is very important here for us in the region and for Slovakia, because there is no other vital option that we see but to have next to us a sovereign and whole Ukraine that is actually part of the European family. So in that sense, yes, the Russian war in Ukraine provided, in a sense, a credibility to France here in the region by being also by holding the presidency and being able to coordinate. There are also some things that knock down the credibility, and Georgina also mentioned that some of the comments from the French presidents were taken as non-agreeable to some of the governments here, and the Slovak government, for example, as well. And again, this comes to this idea that
which ones?
Let's careful what we do next with Russia and not to humiliate Russia. This was definitely taken quite harsh, because it was seen as trying to already think about compromise. And this is why I mentioned the option here doesn't exist other than sovereign whole Ukraine, right? This is kind of the key here, what it has been seen as important to pursue. So in this context, then, when we look at some of the goals and results, maybe, let's see, maybe 3 points I will mention. So the first one, of course, we already discussed, and this is in the topic of our conversation today, talking about European sovereignty, and definitely the French government has been very carefully spearheading this shift, right? First the rhetoric and now of action as well, moving towards some level of European sovereignty, not only trying to define it and redefine it, but actually moving on to some action. But I think that in this case, when it comes to building and bolstering, especially this is kind of coming from the Versailles Declaration, right, bolstering European defense capabilities, the war became a little bit of a reality check, at least how we see it here in the region. Because if you think from the perspective of Central and Eastern European countries, I would say here, those that are on the eastern flank, and immediately exposed to the danger and possible war, really the place to go for ensuring their security was and still is NATO. So this reinforced something that the region has been looking and prioritizing, right? This is the collective work through the alliance, through the NATO alliance, seeing where we can assure our security. And actually, this year's Globsec trends came out just the beginning of this month. And we can see a strong support among citizens as well. So until now, I'm talking about governments, but this is also the citizens' perception, a very, very strong increase in support of NATO. So for example, in Poland, not surprisingly, but in Poland last year was 89%, this year is 95%. In Hungary, from 80%, again, support for NATO, from 80%, this year is 85%. Czech Republic, even from 72 to 82%, we're talking about 10% jump. And Slovakia, similar, from 63 to 72%. So this really means that even the citizens themselves, when we talk about security and deterrence, they associate the importance of NATO. Now, this is not to knock down and to say that there were no important steps taken in the right direction by the French presidency. So the Versailles Declaration, already I mentioned, bolstering defense capabilities, was agreed by all leaders to have this text. The joint defense procurement instrument that was suggested, you already, Paul, mentioned that, an important new step as well, trying to close the gap existing. And of course, the strategic compass, right? So keeping in mind the strategic compass was the first strategic document since the global strategy in 2016. And it's a little bit more binding, right? It was adopted, it had the input of all member states, it was carefully also timed between the German presidency to be finished and adopted now during the French presidency to kind of keep this motor running, the Franco-German motor running. Talking to representatives, for example, of the Slovak government, actually very much open to the fact that they were part of the process, very much open to discuss. But nevertheless, at the end, again, clearly stating that priority is to focus on NATO and NATO support for the eastern flank, which we'll be seeing these days also on a NATO summit, the ideas of permanent bases, for example, in some of the eastern flank countries. But with that said, again, when we talk about European sovereignty, and again, under that umbrella, it's not just defense and security, right? If we think about it, it's much broader. And this is where, on the other hand, there was, when we talk about energy dependence, reducing energy dependence, right? Here, we see exponentially increased willingness for action from our region. So while we knew very well that we are dependent and their potential threats and their potential dangers, crisis hits, and actually we are very much willing to look for short-term and long-term solutions, right? To save the day for the next winter, but also to move forward as well.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So in this case, we see that the French proposal makes sense, and the French presidency has worked in the right direction when it comes to a type, let's say, different types of European sovereignty. And in this case, actually, when we talk about energy, we don't talk much about it, but there is another dependency. We talk about gas and oil quite a bit, but a lot of our countries that actually use nuclear power. Mm-hmm. Our plants are commissioned by Russian companies, which means that actually also those raw materials come from there. And so this is a little bit a more long-term process that we can withhold longer, but this is also another issue to think about when we start talking about energy dependence.
Okay.
And of course, mm-hmm.
Yes, Vladislava, can we leave it there, and can I move over to Žiga? Well, thank you very much, and very interesting on what you said on public opinion, in particular coming from Austria. I think Austria is experiencing different developments here than some of the countries you have mentioned. It would have been an outlier in your Globsec, latest Globsec trend. And I think what makes the Slavkov format so important, so interesting, because we're so close, but we're sometimes we seem to live on different planets, which we don't, but we have different perception on things. And I think their exchange of view is more and more important. Žiga, over to you. How do you view the last 6 months with all this unexpected and striking developments, and in particular, as you focus in your research, or you have focused your research on EU enlargement, how do you see the performance of France there? I'm asking because I sense the sort of French reluctance to further enlarge, and because there were so many things on the agenda that actually the Western Balkans was not among the priorities, while there was quite a turn, at least from my perception, regarding a tentative and now materialized candidate status of Ukraine. What do you make of this, and what is your assessment?
Thank you so much, Paul. It's always interesting to go the last in between the panelists, because basically everything important has already been said and all the good ideas have already been put on the table. But I'll try to bridge it a little bit towards the Czech presidency. I will be happy to cover the EU enlargement perspective. Well, from the Czech perspective, when we look back at the French presidency, still ongoing presidency, as Mr. Ambassador mentioned in the beginning, there obviously, has been some tremendous work done. The role of France was unique during the escalation of the war in Ukraine, and I believe it was actually a perfect timing for France to lead the council at that time. At the same time, now looking at the Czech presidency, I think it's also quite a good fit for the tasks ahead for us, because obviously we needed a strong leadership at the immediate weeks and months of the war. At the same time, more we will get into this kind of, long-term war without any further big escalations, the more we will need to look into a country that will be able to actually moderate the discussion. I think one of the most pressing issues for the Czech presidency will really be maintaining the unity among the member states in its position towards Russia. With all the sanctions, the longer the war will be, the more difficult it will be to keep the unity, especially if we talk about another packages of sanctions, especially when we talk about the energy dependency of Central and Eastern European countries. Vladi was already talking about this. This will be really difficult. And I believe actually Czech Republic can be a perfect fit in that sense. It's very different to France, obviously, that usually comes with 200 plus proposals, puts them on the table and says, this is our, priorities, and we really want you to support this. I believe we have, historical and cultural links when it comes to the Czech Republic with Ukraine. And I believe that another important aspect really is that the new government in Czech Republic is very keen on putting the support to Ukraine at the center of everything that will be based around the Czech presidency. So when it comes to this political level, I believe that actually cooperation between the French and the Czech presidency is a very good fit, that actually the Czech one can follow up on a lot of tasks that has been actually started by the French. When it comes to the legislation, I will just try to briefly outline that also. There has been a lot of actually movement and some shifts within the legislation that is currently ongoing in Brussels. But to be also a bit critical, I would say that actually the most pressing, the most difficult tasks were kind of put towards the Czech presidency. When we talk about the new migration pact, the question of solidarity was kind of moved forward. We have some small progress when it comes to the certain parts of the migration pact, but the biggest, elephant in the room is the question of solidarity, and that's been moved for the Czech presidency. When it comes to the Fit for 55 package, I believe that actually today the ministers are meeting to support hopefully some of the files connected to the package, especially the ETS system, the CBAM, the social fund. But still, we will have a very pressing area of electromobility or decarbonization of automotive industry that the Czechs will need to follow up on. We will have the outcomes of the conference on the future of Europe, which again, some of the countries, and it wasn't few of them, expressed actually, negative attitudes towards opening the treaties. So there will be a lot of tasks ahead, and I believe that Czechs will also try to achieve as many successes as possible. So that just to kind of link the discussion a little bit in between the French and the Czech presidency. To go back to what you, Paul, asked, but also what Mr. Ambassador asked at the end about actually these, new incentives regarding the EU enlargement policy, the new ideas that are stemming from the French President Macron. I would see it in two different lights. I believe that it was very important to get the enlargement agenda back on the table, because for the past decade or so, basically from the time that Croatia joined in 2013, enlargement was kind of in a turmoil, not really being interested to anyone except the Central European countries, I would say, when we talk especially about Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Austria. I would maybe also mention Germany. So now, it's at the spotlight, and I think it's very important for this general approach towards the sovereignty in this global age, because where else to start than in our neighborhoods, in the countries that actually have the European perspective or wish to have the European perspective, wish to become part of this bloc. And I would go back to what President Macron said actually at the end of last week's council, that we don't all need to share the same house, but we can all live on the same street. I think it's a good first step, but I think in the end, the goal for all the candidate countries needs to be the membership. Because if we talk about the current state of the enlargement, I know, well, we have the new enlargement methodology from 2020 proposed by the French, created by the European Commission. And I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel again. The current state of the methodology is pretty sufficient. It offers some sectoral cooperation, sectoral integration. It also has this kind of like a full stop, in the sense that if the country's progress stops or start to backslide, we can actually revert some of the parts. But in the end, creating more tools will create it only more difficult for the countries that wish to join the EU. And with the new methodology, it's actually not that new anymore. As I mentioned, from 2020, still some of the member states are not really sure how exactly will it function. The civil servants, I talk with a lot of people from the Western Balkans, need to study each file step by step, learn it by heart to understand a bit better. If we start with a new incentive, with new ideas, it's going to take another 3-5 years. And in the end, we have actually no end to this. So I believe that, let's say, this idea of European political community is an interesting concept, that if it goes in line with the enlargement policy, can be very helpful. But to be a bit negative, I'm a bit afraid, and we all know the position of France towards the enlargement, I'm a bit afraid that it will kind of derail the whole process and make it even more complicated. And really, just to say this one more time, enlargement policy is the strongest tool that we have as the EU to actually not only stabilize, but kind of support the democratic transition of the countries in our neighborhoods. And it's the strongest tool that we actually can use towards those countries achieving progress. So there has been a lot of actually questions regarding this political community, whether this would not set a standard for some of the autocrats, for example, in the Western Balkans, to actually, be included in the sectoral areas, to get even more funding, but to really not be pushed to, commit to the progress in the fields of democracy, rule of law, even green agenda, etc. So there's a lot of questions, and I believe the only correct way is to enhance the enlargement policy, to really put it at the top of the list for the upcoming, not only Czech presidency, but for the upcoming years, because it's the only way we can not only stabilize, but maintain this discussion of not only Ukraine, but other countries becoming part of our family.
Žiga, let me ask a follow-up question also to you. I mean, if we just have to look at the European Council conclusions of the end of last week to see that there are two processes which we have to deal with in parallel. On the one hand, the enlargement process, make progress there, make sure that the reforms are actually taken seriously, implemented on a sustainable basis, criteria are met, and on the other hand, the European Union has to be ready to absorb in the future, whenever that will be, new member states. So we have these two processes of enlarging and deepening at the same time, which go hand in hand. And then, because we've talked about the conference on the future of Europe, and you have also emphasized again the idea of this European political community, my question would be, what are the plans during the next 6 months of the Czech EU Council presidency to moderate this process? The European Parliament has actually pushed for a convention. Political leaders have been rather quiet on this issue. Where do you see possible exchange of views and progress, possibilities of progress there?
So I would start with the enlargement policy, as that is probably the most urgent question now. And also it's an area that the Czech Republic strongly supports from basically early 90s. It was always at the center of Czech foreign policy, the support towards the Western Balkans, to the Eastern Partnership countries. And I think the Czechs will maintain this very high on their agenda during the presidency. Obviously, following up to the idea of the political community, I've been told that actually starting from basically early May, the civil servants at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the people at the Office of the Government, started the preparations and work on actually kind of implementing this idea in a constructive discussion during the Czech presidency. Because so far, one thing that we need to say is there's not much information about what exactly should it be, how should it look, which countries should we actually involve in it. Obviously, we have some ideas to involve not only the Eastern Partnership countries, the Western Balkans, but also, for example, Turkey or United Kingdom. So the Czech civil servants will be working on that. And recently, we also heard some talks that actually the informal summit that will be organized in Prague at the beginning of October could be in the end focused on this, because we had plans, or the Czech government had plans to organize a high-level conference with Ukraine. Obviously, with the ongoing war in Ukraine, this is a bit difficult to achieve. So this could be one of the options, one of the things that the Czech presidency could achieve, a bit bigger open discussion on the idea of European political community. When it comes,
No, please.
When it comes to the conference on the future of Europe, and I think this is very closely connected to the question of enlargement and the future of Europe as such, is opening of the treaties. And I believe
not necessarily, no.
Well,
not necessarily.
Not necessarily with that, but when it comes to the enlargement policy, just to finish my idea on that, I don't think that we can successfully continue and implement the accession of new member states without the qualified majority voting in the enlargement policy.
For which you don't have to open the treaty.
Well, yes, but for that, we need to have the discussion over the QMV in general. And that would be, obviously, we can go with, Passarella and stuff like that. But let's go back to like a bigger discussion over the QMV, because obviously, some of the member states, including Czech Republic, were very negative to when it comes to general idea of opening the treaties, or even general idea of the QMV voting. At the same time, now when we have this situation in the enlargement policy, they say, okay, let's open it, let's open the discussion, and let's see, because we would actually be in favor of having the QMV voting in the enlargement process. And, again, in the end, it would still need to be adopted by all of the member states' parliament, in case we decide to, get Montenegro as a new member state, or whichever other countries. So, we would still have this kind of full stop in case some of the countries wouldn't agree with the adoption of new member states. But at the same time, it wouldn't block the process as we currently see it with the situation of Bulgaria and North Macedonia. Mm-hmm. And although the Bulgarians passed something in the parliament, I don't think it will actually move the things forward.
I agree. Well, there are already questions coming in through the Q&A button. Please keep on sending the questions. I will use them for a final round of the panel. And in between having you sending the question, I would like to ask the ambassador if he wants to react to what has been said quickly. And in particular, I would pose two questions to you. One is, when was the French shift towards the candidate status of the Ukraine? And the second one is on the European political community. Is this an idea, or do you already have a clear concept of where this should go?
Thank you, Paul, for these very easy questions. So
always.
Just to react, not to add something to your rich developments. I took a lot of notes, but just if I may, to react to what has been told. One remark about elections, if I may. Never has Europe been so present in the political domestic life of my country, but in a very soft and not a negative and polemical way. Even dealing with the question of the COVID, the pandemic, and Europe facing the pandemic. So just to say that we had elections, we talked about Europe, and one of the first victory of this presidency is to have imagined that Europe is a normal matter of domestic debate in French domestic life. In my opinion, really, for my perception, is really important. The second thing I would like to add should be to react to the question of la conférence du futur de l'avenir de l'Europe, the conference of the future of Europe. We have to remind that we are in front of a new methodology, and a new methodology during a dramatic period. So it's normal that the results are less visible. It's normal because the first victory of this conference is that the conference took place. The platform did exist. Young people, even in the universities in France and even in Austria, as I could mention, it worked. Now the result is the question of using the result is another question. But I'm not convinced that the right thing is to consider that the conference of the future of Europe failed. I'm not saying that it was a fully success, but a new methodology of putting at the heart of the new way of making politics Europe has been reached. And a third thing I would like to add, in my opinion, I think that we perhaps could have neglected the fact that during our presidency, and not only during our presidency, but during our presidency, we had the purpose to show that Europe was talking with the other continents. And in my opinion of ambassador, and in my opinion of an historian of Europe, is not so pedestrian, it's not so banal to consider that we have the capability, the opportunity of talking about the unity of Europe, but talking about a new relationships between this European unity and the other continents, starting by Africa. It's not so, I don't know whether or not it's a fully success, but anyway, the fact of rebuilding, even during the war, new relationships between Europe and Africa was an important purpose. And many things have been done. And even if now Africa perhaps has to struggle against disinformation, but it works. And the same thing for multilateralism. Our presidency was a presidency of sovereignty oriented, or I don't know, connected to a new vision of multilateralism and relationships with l'OTAN, with other extra-European continental rapport de force. And I would like to insist to stress this point. We have to analyze, to put in exam the French presidency of Europe, even dealing with the extra-continental dimension of our presidency. And now to answer your question about Ukraine, what is the behind this? What is the real question? And the real is to know whether or not we could go on having a perfect, clear relationship between the two enlarged, or between a global vision of enlargement, or if it's only a political and moral response to the dramatic predicament. I think really that the response, the answer, is a global one. So that we have not to separate. And I don't know whether or not it's possible to evoke a shift, but it's always a way of considering that the response has to be global and to be gradual in all the circumstances, even if we have to express a political and moral response to Ukraine beginning.
Thank you very much. I would like to start with the final round and bring in the question of the audience and ask the panelists to be as short as possible. Because the ambassador mentioned the global dimension of European integration, or even the French outreach during the EU Council presidency. You've mentioned Africa. Dietmar, a question to you, posed by one of the people watching us, on the role of EU-Africa relationship concerning EU's digital sovereignty, also with regards to massive Chinese activities in Africa. How do you see this EU-Africa relationship at the moment when European sovereignty, also in the digital area, is actually gaining ground?
Well, I think when it comes to the African summit, the ambassador rightly pointed out that the important thing was that the European Union was not only self-contained, focused on the European Union, but was sort of acting globally, even against the background of the biggest crisis in the post-war era. Now, the African summit, of course, took place just a bit before the invasion of Ukraine. And I think, therefore, it was overlooked a bit that obviously the idea was to reset the relationship with a number of new ideas, including making Africa a priority area in the framework of the Global Gateway Program. Now, of course, the situation is a different one, but if you look, for instance, also at the fact that Africa was represented or is represented at the G7 summit in Elmau at the moment, it clearly shows that Africa remains a priority partner for the European Union. I think it's also important to see that sort of the relationship between the European Union and other partners outside Europe has also been impacted by the war in Ukraine, I think in a way which reinforced the geopolitical dimension of the European Union. Think not only of NATO, as the ambassador said, but look also, for instance, at the much stronger relationship between the European Union and Japan with Korea, its engagement in the Indo-Pacific. I think very few people would have imagined a couple of months ago that the European Union would not only be able to act decisively against the aggression in the Ukraine, but at the same time also establish itself as a partner in a global response to this crisis, because it's not only a regional one. That's important. And I think what is also important, as you mentioned, is of course the digital agenda, and this certainly did not fall by the wayside. I think it was very much a priority of the French presidency, which was kept alive. And I think when it comes to the sovereignty dimension, clearly the digital area is one of the most important ones to address jointly and commonly. So I think that is, something which is important to see for the time being, at least. And of course, there are questions to what extent this unity can continue and be maintained. But for the time being, I think the European response, certainly also to a large extent under French leadership, is one which has reinforced the geopolitical situation of Europe beyond Europe.
Dietmar, then there's one question, something completely different, but as you are from Austria, a question which I need to pose to you from Sabine Radl. She's the head of the European movement in Austria. She asks, what is the main driver of the critical perception of NATO in Austria?
Well, I have a very clear personal opinion on that, which might not necessarily reflect that of the Austrian government, but it's clear that in Europe, Austria is a bit of an outlier in this debate. And I think the reason is that for too long we have seen neutrality as part of the Austrian identity in a way which does not really fit into the current assessment of what the situation is, certainly not the current security assessment. And what we see is the beginning of a debate, which I hope will go much further, and which will clearly show that there is an interest, if you start the discussion, also in Austria, about the security dimension of the challenges which the war in the Ukraine clearly pointed out. And you can see already a number of comments made. You see an initiative to say we need a new security doctrine. We need to address the situation in a more rational, also in a more honest way. I'm all in favor of that. And I hope that sort of this policy of just looking the other way and saying security is something which is for the others, which take care of ours, that's no longer an option in the future.
Okay, Georgina, over to you. I would like to ask you on the European political community, what do you make of this idea, which is more of an idea than already a full-fledged concept? I mean, if we look at the Council conclusions of the European Council from last week, it is the first point actually of the European Council conclusions, while on page 7, heads of states and government talk about the conference on the future of Europe. And even if you look at the G7 tweeting, the meeting, but there was a tweet by Macron who talked about this with the British Prime Minister, who was very interested, apparently, in this idea. And well, it was actually proposed by the French president on the 9th of May in the European Parliament. What do you make of this? Is this an idea to actually accelerate integration, approximation, Europeanization of the European neighborhood and European partners, or is this another way of viewing enlargement?
Thanks, Paul. It's a really important question, because I think there's been lots of commentary about it being an alternative to enlargement, but I don't really buy that, actually. I think for President Macron, of course, it's very difficult no one's in President Macron's head apart from President Macron, but when you look at when he first talked about it, he always maintained that there were 3 tracks when you think of particularly the context of Ukraine. So the one is unconditional political, financial, military, support to Ukraine. At the same time, recognizing Ukrainians' EU membership aspirations with candidate status, and then he was sort of brutally honest to the point where I was like, did he need to be that honest and did he need to repeat it so many times? But he said, enlargement process is complicated. It will take years and it could take decades, and he's right on that, and Žiga can talk about it ad nauseum, I think, but it is a very complex process. You can't fast track membership. You can fast track candidate status, but you simply cannot fast track membership. And also because it's not just about the negotiations, it's also about that ratification stage, about getting the unanimity in the council, majority in the parliament, but then potentially also national assemblies and regional assemblies having to vote on this. In the case of France, you could even have a referendum, so that it's not an easy process. And so the French government's view is, what do we do in the meantime? Because what we have now is not satisfactory. Žiga talked about it. There's been no real movement on enlargement since 2000, or since Croatia joined the EU. You've heard the Western Balkans over and over again say this is not satisfactory. So what can you do in the meantime? So I think that's where the idea really comes from, is how can we integrate not only those countries with candidate EU membership aspirations, but also countries like the UK who have left. What can we do more together? And the council conclusions say the EU leaders spoke about it, about their decision to potentially launch at some point this European political community, but that it was a political dialogue at the highest level, which presumably underpinned by a lot of technical work, to get Europeans, so continental Europeans, to think, so not just continental because you've got British and the Irish, but Europeans as a whole, to think about how they can protect their continent. But it's a very French, the way it was done was very French, in that you sort of poof in this idea, this concept, but no real kind of technical detail around it. But I think that's partly strategic, in that France realizes that this has to be a European construct, so everyone needs to come together and think about it. So I think it's too early, but it's not a bad idea, and it's certainly not an alternative to enlargement.
Yes, I mean, that's actually what is said in the European Council conclusions, to be fair. This is notably not an alternative to enlargement, and it will fully respect the European Union's decision-making autonomy, and the European Council will revert to this issue probably in the next weeks and months to come. Thank you, Georgina. Over to you, Vladislava. There are some questions on whether we are really aware of the costs of non-enlargement of the Western Balkans and non-inclusion of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldavia. Do people and do politics in Europe understand the historical, decisiveness of the moment and the importance of this decision and the cost of not doing anything?
Thank you very much, Paul. Before answering this question, I just wanted to revert very quickly. I know that we are very short on time. A little bit about the Conference on the Future of Europe. I agree that maybe we cannot deem it hugely successful, but there is purpose to the conference, and maybe, yes, it's not the sole impetus for reforms to follow. So not only opening treaties, but also other type of reforms can be done without the legal framework that we have, opening some sleeping beauties, etc. But maybe in a combination with the consequences that we're going to be seeing from the war, these two together might be a very powerful impetus to start seeing some movement. Of course, first it's going to be everything that can be done quickly, then everything that can be possibly done within the legal framework, and then let's see if we can open the treaties. I think this is probably the mindset that we'll be seeing on a European as well as the national policy making level. But what I wanted to point out, what is important for our region, and what is, I think, a success of this conference, is that this was a very important learning experience for us. This was a learning experience when it comes to deliberative democracy, because we have a very low track record when it comes to this type of initiatives, this type of work. This is not used much, not like in France or Ireland or even in Austria on different levels. So for us, if we can take even only that for ourselves, that means that the region is strengthening our democracy inside our countries. And then therefore, we're strengthening overall European democracy. So there is this dimension that sometimes we forget about it. But for us, if we take advantage of it, this will be a very, very, very important part. And then very quickly on the global dimension, we didn't talk today at all about China. And this was also something that overall during the French presidency, not much was, it was not a topical issue. But we do see a change in threat perceptions, for example. I just wanted to give you more numbers just for fun to finish the day off with numbers. But according to our latest trends, again, we do see increase of the sense that China is also a threat. So in Czech Republic right now runs around 50% that see the country as a threat. In Poland, 43 from 34 last year. And in Slovakia, 29 from 23. But we're seeing an increase, and we're seeing that trend that eventually we'll have to start talking about China. And I don't know if the Czech presidency will be doing it, but this is something to mention. And last, before I answer your question, is on US. And US is a strategic partner that it is equalizing now in percentages here in our region to Germany. And Germany has been traditionally seen as our cornerstone of strategic partners. And now we see actually that through the consequences and the response and NATO, I think there is in connection, the US is coming again on the forefront. On the cost and the risks, of course, we need to be aware of this importance of the moment and reaction on the moment. Actually, I admit I am Bulgarian myself. So when we talk about the veto, the Bulgarian veto and North Macedonia, it's a very important and complicated question, aside from my personal beliefs and official position. But it is the Bulgarians that brought back, in a sense, the agenda with the Western Balkan Summit during their presidency, where, as Žiga was saying, for a while, it was just dead end to talk even about enlargement in any shape or form. And now, we see how things are changing and how sometimes domestic politics can have a huge influence on the long-term decisions. But with that said, yes, I agree that we do need to explain to the citizens, and this is why we need to explain to the citizens and to the politicians the importance in the long-term gains that we can have all if we take this spur of the moment and react now and quickly and reasonably. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, and actually, we usually say that European affairs is actually also the most domestic politics. So I mean, this is about the European diversity with all its pros and cons. That's how Europe works, and sometimes blocks itself. But European integration is somehow the art of reaching a compromise. So we will be reaching a compromise there as well, better sooner than later. Žiga, over to you. Maybe you can also, in your final reaction, respond to one of the question that was raised by the audience, which is, will the Czech Republic during its presidency dedicate enough time on the strategic compass and its implementation, and the question of raising defense spending, which is comparatively rather low within the European Union?
Indeed, I think it's not the problem of EU. It's also the problem when we look at the regional, platforms of cooperation. Even for us as Czechs within the V4 format, for example, we have difficulties to find actually a common position on these common purchases of, arms. And obviously, this is a big issue that needs to be raised. Czech Republic did mention actually security cooperation as one of its main priorities. So I believe the task is for the presidency to work on this. They will definitely focus more on reinforcing the security capabilities and the partnership with the NATO. I believe that also when it comes to the specific cooperation on the military, purchases, I believe there's a lot to expand on, and it's actually specifically mentioned in the priorities. So we'll see how successful will the Czech presidency be, but they mentioned it several times in the list of priorities. So let's hope for that.
Thank you, Žiga. Gilles, Mr. Ambassador, the final words always, like the first words, go to the ambassador. Your turn.
just to thank you really for this discussion, and to tell you that we are really waiting with a great impatience and with a great interest the debate about the Czech presidency, and I thank you really for all the topical issues which have been evoked this morning. I have not to conclude our French presidency because it's, as I have said, it's not yet finished. So thank you for helping us to finish it.
No, we're not finishing yet. We still have some days to go, but we will conclude our discussion today. Let me just add, I think, to the Conference on the Future of Europe that this simply the dimension of dialogue and the degree of dialogue and interaction which we have seen in many, many European countries and across border is already very much value added to the discussion on the future of European integration. And the outcome is something that will, of course, not be neglected. 49 concrete proposals which need to be followed up on, and which many of them will need to be in one way or the other implemented, and many of them can be implemented with the sufficient degree of political will and without any treaty changes. But work will be ongoing. Let me, having said this, let me thank you all very much, particularly the French embassy and the French ambassador to Austria, Gilles, for his support, but in particular also, of course, the Center for French-European relations and rapprochement in Europe, in person here, and on behalf of the Center, Dietmar, Schweisgut, for making this all possible. And also, of course, Georgina, Wright, Vladislava, Gubalova, and Žiga, Faktor, for joining us here today, and all the audience and the participants. Thank you for joining. Thank you for sending in your comments. I've tried to take up some of them. Others will be discussed soon. I think there's so many issues on the table that we need to continue our discussion. But we live in exciting times, and I think there's so much going on that we will be in touch. We will keep in touch, and we will continue to increase also the how shall I say, our engagement, our European engagement. I think these are the times when change happens, and this is where we are, because we want to be part of that change. Having said this, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Have a nice day, and all the best to Brussels, to Bratislava, to Prague, to Paris, and in particular to the French embassy. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.